Hello and welcome to this CSCMP UK Roundtable event. I am Len Pannett, the Vice President of Programmes for the UK Roundtable for CSCMP. And joining me today is David Lyon, a renowned Chief Procurement Officer who's going to share some of the insights of his career over the last couple of decades working with various organisations on the contrast between procurement with different sorts of organisations. Before I ask David to introduce himself, a little about the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals for those who haven't come across us before. CSCMP was founded in 1963, and since then it has dedicated itself to leading the supply chain profession by connecting, developing, and educating the world's logistics and supply chain management professionals throughout their careers. To do so, CSCMP exists to provide opportunities for supply chain professionals to communicate in order to develop and improve their supply chain management skills, to identify and conduct research which adds to the knowledge base of supply chain theory and practice, and to create awareness of the significance of supply chain to business and to the economy. Today, CSCMP has a worldwide membership of over 11,000, all organised in local, municipal, regional and national roundtables across the world. For more information, you can visit cscmp.org. Now, returning to today's fireside chat. The world of procurement has been going through a series of changes over the last few years, and as that change has happened, so people have been moving through different organisations. Joining me today is David Lyon, who will be discussing some of these contrasts between how procurement works in larger, smaller and non-governmental organisations. But before we start, David, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Len. Really a pleasure to have this chat with you today. So, as Len says, I'm David Lyon. I've been working as a procurement professional for probably the last 25 years, although I'm sure you're all going to say that I don't look that old. My background in procurement really spans every type of industry, from pharmaceuticals through to electronics, government and non-government organizations, so large financial institutions, and including smaller organizations. So at the moment, I'm looking at the leisure industry and various different smaller clients. Really broad background.
Excellent, David. Thank you so much. Well, look, you've worked at both ends of the spectrum, from these global corporates with vast infrastructure to leaner, faster moving organizations, a few of those SMEs and NGOs. Now, each of those sorts of organizations comes with its own pace, its own politics, and its own possibilities. What is it that you enjoy about working in a large organization as a CPO compared to, say, a smaller one? And what are the benefits, the challenges that each sort of environment brings to the procurement leadership's perspective?
Yeah, it's a really good question. One I've struggled with over the last few years. When I've worked with large organizations, and these are huge, enormous multinationals, what I've loved is the ability to actually work with, first of all, a challenging and really capable set of peers. And that level of challenge and that level of insight really expands your knowledge and challenges your own preconceptions. And obviously, those larger organizations also come with a massive amount of technology and support that underpins what you do. All of which means that when you're actually out there on the coalface as a procurement professional, you're dealing with cutting edge procurement, leading with cutting edge tools often, and you're actually driving at the front leading edge. If I worked in a smaller organization, however, the decision making, wow. I mean, I've got to tell you, you know it, Len, as well as I do. The decision making, the entrepreneurship is much quicker. You can try programs where you go in and you fail fast, and you deliberately design those programs to fail fast. And most gratifying for me as a procurement professional is you get to deliver change quickly. I mean, some of the initiatives that we drive in small organizations can take 30-40% cost out within a space of a month or so. Now, that you just don't get that level of feedback from large organizations.
And how does that contrast, not just looking at the commercial side, but the contrast between commercial and, say, NGOs and charitable bodies?
Yeah, the charitable bodies and NGOs, two slightly different beasts. If you look at the charity sector, so the third sector, the unifying feature is you are driven by core purpose. And what that means as a procurement leader, you can then tie all of your initiatives back to that core purpose. So if we save £1 on internal cleaning services, we have £1 more to spend on saving lives. You can actually make that direct comparison, and the benefit there, this alignment is palpable. NGOs slightly more difficult. So I was working with a large international financial institution, and there it's almost the opposite level. Those large financial institutions really want you to be able to show the transparency. They often have multiple different stakeholders, all with their own vested interest. And for them, actually showing that you're being fair and showing that you're following a process was absolutely paramount. The idea that you can't be quite as free and unconstrained within those types of structure.
Excellent. There's a perception as well that the job when you're working in those value-driven organizations, particularly NGOs and charities, that the job involves working with suppliers, working with partners that share those values. But would you say that that's true, or that that's now pervading all different sorts of organizations?
I think there's some fundamental decisions. So if you are, for example, working in a charity that is focused on cancer, there is no way that you want to have any of your supply chain directly linked with, for example, the tobacco industry. So there are some competing elements there. I think when I found working with NGOs is actually making sure that the stakeholders' needs are covered by the supply base. So particularly in the organization I was working, they were looking for a good balance across the countries from which the donors had put their money forward. And actually they were wanting to see that this was fair and equitable across their countries as a way of developing the capability internally. So there's very definitely a different way and a different alignment behind those core values.
Excellent. And if we look at
one last thing, Len. But what is absolutely common across all of them, and particularly large, small organization, is this need for procurement to be the experts in understanding the supply chain and bringing and linking together the multiple different departments together to understand and use their expertise.
Absolutely, and that goes, that's almost hits the heart of why CSCMP exists. It's to transcend those different functional areas and bring those together. So no longer do we talk about procurement and logistics and manufacturing and planning as all separate areas. They are part of supply chain. And I'm very much a student of the school of thought that supply chains include plan, source, make, deliver, return, that was set up back in the 90s. If we look at the one area in particular, in large organizations, process tends to be king. You can think about the frameworks that those organizations has, the level of governance that they have, the needs and process for compliance and so forth, all in the name of consistency and scale. And in smaller organizations, you don't always have the resources available, both the people and the finances, to cover those overheads. So do you think it's realistic, even desirable for smaller organizations to replicate those large corporate procurement processes, maybe in a smaller setting? And where should we distinguish, we draw the line between, say, for example, discipline and agility that each of those organizations brings?
I think you might be surprised by my answer, Len, to say, actually, I think that process and that governance and that structure is important, irrespective of the size of the organization. And if I look at procurement, it's equally about personality, the ability for you to get together with a stakeholder, share objectives and share understanding, but also the process of bringing them along. And I think if you shortchange on those processes, what you're likely to do is throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you forget the analogy. Essentially, the procurement process relies on us doing the thinking in advance and making sure that that thinking is documented well enough that the stakeholder group can understand it and can sign up to it. And therefore, I think the larger organizations that have those processes, many of them can be replicated in a more simplified fashion. So I know when I go into an organization, I look at where the complexity is from a large organization. And what I do is I strip out the unnecessary elements, focus down on the core intent of what that process is trying to do, and then put in place something really simple that gets to the same output using all the key steps. If you miss out any of them, I think honestly, if you look at something like a supply chain risk process,
Mhm.
without having an end-to-end process. It is just ticking boxes.
Does that mean that there's a role, particularly with the smaller organizations, that there's not just a role, but there should be encouragement for them to work with solutions such as automation, such as working with partners and outsourcing those parts of the process where they might not have the overheads to be able to do it, but they can get somebody to do that almost on an as a service basis?
100% agree. So if you look at the tools that are out there at the moment, if you look at companies like EcoVadis, you look at Dun & Bradstreet, what they do is they become solution providers that actually feed the data and feed the knowledge into you. And you can link those directly into your systems so that actually you get almost live time updates on the bits of information that traditionally you would have had to spend months going out and researching and having processes in the background. You can use technology now to actually replicate many of the functions of a large organization really, really simply. If I go back to some of the other things, I worked with an organization, just a two-man organization that was really struggling with getting into one of the large major banks. They had to go through a 25-point onboarding plan with every single document scrutinized by a team over in India. And it took them the best part of 6 months to get onboarded to do 5 coaching sessions.
Mm-hmm.
There are processes which the larger organizations carry out for good reason, but I don't necessarily think that they always apply them in the correct way. And I think when you're coming to a smaller organization or a more charitable organization, you can choose to be a little bit less, not a little bit less disciplined, equally disciplined, but more agile with it.
Yes, and I think one of the lessons from several organizations doing things like this is that you can outsource the responsibility for execution, but ultimately the accountability for how it's done still resides with yourself, with the company that is the customer for that service. Excellent.
But there are some really good companies out there that can help you along the way, and the traditional companies as well as the new modern ones. So if you look at something like modern slavery risk, or if you're looking at carbon reduction initiatives, you could pay for having your own team, your own in-house capability, use your own team time to manage them, or you pay almost the same amount to actually bring the experts in and they can advise, they can source it, and actually you just need to listen and present. And actually that's the real skill of a smaller organization, that you use your external supply chain to deliver the same amount of output for the limited amount of resources you have.
Yes, yes. And as technology has been advancing, it's amazing how tactical some of this support can be. There's one company I know, Market Dojo, that provide a reverse auction platform to reduce the lead time for running auction events. And by doing so, they're not only finding better value in the final procurement, but they're finding much better engagement with their supply base. Essentially, they're pre-qualifying their supply base and just reducing the lead time for those parts of the procurement process that are laborious, but unnecessarily so. Well, on this topic of procurement, procurement tech has been evolving fast. We've moved, I think, from the days in the 90s and the early 2000s of clunky ERPs to smart sourcing platforms and AI-led analytics, as is very much the in vogue terminology. But the tools alone don't solve the problems. It's how they're used and by whom that counts. So, in your experience, looking at the different ways of bringing these things together, how critical is technology as an enabler to for effective procurement? And what does good adoption actually look like across those different types of organizations?
Len, for me, actually, this is where a smaller organization has a chance to leapfrog some of those larger companies that are out there. Yet again, I'm still working with some very large organizations. Their old ERP systems with clunky different country by country approaches with funny little bolt-ons in separate markets still exist in many, many markets today. And I think as a small organization, what you can do is you can look out to the external marketplace, and there are some excellent procurement tools, things that you can deploy in 2 or 3 months and will give you 95% of the functionality. And that means that as a small organization, you can benefit from ready-made chatbot platforms, ready-made analytical platforms, ready-made reports that you can run at the click of a button rather than having to recreate and restructure all these things separately. So I think there's some real opportunity here for particularly smaller companies that haven't necessarily had that large amount of investment, to make that investment now and bring that knowledge and the skill set. And the importance of it is not necessarily having the technology, but being able to use it and having the time to be able to use it. And you're right. I mean, the culture and the adoption is critical. And your question was, what does good adoption look like? For me personally, look at the tool, select the tool for what you want it to do, and then adopt the out-of-the-box functionality. The more you mess around with the core functionality, the more you try and bend it to the old ways of doing things, the more difficult it is actually to get people to buy in. Whereas if you look at this as a tool, as an enabler to get your capability up to another level, you can be up and running within a relatively short space of time.
Yes. And I think that's really important. That cultural piece is the starting point. There needs to be, I found there needs to be a culture where innovation is welcomed, but not for innovation's sake. Your point about focusing on the outcomes you want is very, very true. But at the same time, we shouldn't let analysis paralysis get in the way of being able to have 100% certainty that this approach is going to provide what we want. The companies that I've seen adopting new ways of working and new technologies have taken the view of, we're going to try a few things. Some of them may work, some of them may not, but we will learn with every one of those and improve that way. And that culture needs to not just be sitting at the doer part of the organization or even at the senior. It does have to come through the entire culture of the organization. Otherwise, you end up implementing a tool set that never gets used or gets used erroneously, or worse yet, actually just takes over and repeats the bad habits that we had when we did things on a manual basis.
It's interesting, Len. I was leading a conference a couple of months ago, and one of my panelists sat up and said, David, when I implement a new system, when I look at the technology, as a procurement director or as a head of procurement, I have to be both evangelist and almost designer, because without me leading that, I know that the rest of the team are going to get half-hearted, they're going to lose, they're going to drop off their own attention. I almost have to be running twice as fast as everyone else in order to be able to carry the organization with me. And I think as a leader of small to medium-sized organizations, what I've often found is you and your personality as a leader is quite a lot more physical than it is within a larger organization, where you can have time to sit back and relax and let the rest of the team carry some of the weight. As the leader in those smaller organizations, you really have to be passion, and driving things forward.
Yes, yes. And interesting, you said the visible leadership, because I think that's another really important criteria for successful adoption. It's the leaders who spend the time and listen to their team and go to where their team are before, during, and after the adoption of tools, even just running pilots, because you want to, you not only want to react to people's feelings and the insights that they're providing, but you want to be seen to be doing that as well. That's, I think, one of the big lessons of good leadership, is to be listening, actively listening to what your team's concerns are. Of course, you're not necessarily going to solve everything, but at least to start that stage by listening to that is part of it.
But you mentioned earlier that there's also something about allowing people to fail and to fail quickly. Yes. When you're deploying new adoption on new tools, I think actually as a leader, you've got to let people and almost make it completely comfortable to make mistakes in that journey, because 90% of the stuff will be great, but there's always going to be 10 or 15% of a new technology adoption that's just going to fall by the wayside.
Yes, yes. And on this topic of innovation, small organizations are often seen as hotbeds of innovation, because they're more dynamic, because they're more agile, they've got fewer levels of bureaucracy, while larger ones have the exact opposite. They can lead at scale, but that need for governance delays things. And leadership and innovation aren't guaranteed in either of those two environments. No. What do you see, building on the points earlier about visible leadership, what conditions really allow leadership to flourish, regardless of whether you're in a small organization or a large one?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge for all CPOs, procurement directors. What is it that's going to make me as a leader flourish? And therefore, how do I cascade that same structure, that mindset, that culture down through my organization? And if I summarize it for me, it's primarily around autonomy. And that's the right to make your own decisions and go out and lead in your own way. When I select category managers, when I select category teams, what I expect them to do is not have to be told what to do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't expect them to get it right 100% of the time, but what I expect them to do is not have to ask permission. And for me as a leader, that's kind of what I expect as well from my management team, from the CEO, the COO, some of whom clearly are not procurement professionals. They may not understand it. And so that role of the procurement director or procurement leader is almost to explain and communicate and actually share the value that procurement can bring with those senior leaders, and then respond with what you're going to do towards the company's bottom line. And that business benefit is not something that's passed down to me. It's something that I propose, I put forward and say, this is what we're going to deliver as a function. And this is what I would like for you as a leader to let me do. Now, when it comes to my own teams, that's exactly what I would expect to do to them. Here's the outcome we're going to try and reach. This is your area of expertise. Within that space, I want you to lead it. I want you to drive your own capability. And your question started off by talking about innovation, hotbeds of different technology and different capabilities. I think as an organization, procurement has been far too frequently internally focused, running RFPs, running activities, looking at number and looking at data. And I think the advantage of technology nowadays is that we can start looking externally. Outside within our supply chain are pretty much the answer to every single problem that we as an organization face. And actually, as a procurement team, if we can reach out to those knowledgeable experts and take this mindset of innovating, creating, and driving new solutions, I think the potential is phenomenal.
Are there any particular organizations where you found that to really work very well?
Well, believe it or not, actually, working with a charity was one of the most open to new ideas. Yet again, coming back to the charity sector, very core, very aligned to core purpose. But we were talking to customers, and we were one of the first organizations to use mobile card readers. Mm-hmm. And it's a really simple example, but if you go out and you can collect card payments by, at festivals or on the street, your revenue goes up immediately. Now, that didn't come from our own internal teams. That came via the supply chain route. Talking to suppliers that said, have you thought about, here's some capability which you'd like to take on. And yet again, same type of environment. We were looking at the amount of time that we have to invest in our researchers scanning and reviewing images of cancer cells. And a supplier came to us and said, we've got this brand new AI engine, which will actually analyze those data. And yet again, it's not a cost saving per se, but suddenly overnight, your researcher is freed up from doing 5 hours of manual reviewing and manual classification of photographs or images to actually being able to focus on the research and on the analysis that goes on top of it. So the stuff that our supply base has that I think we can bring in. And interestingly for me, it was the charity sector that was the most innovative in looking outside rather than being stuck inside.
Mm-hmm. And that's such a powerful message of working across those organizational lines, externally and internally as well. The best organizations I've seen operationally have been the ones that there has been a team feeling across the different levels, across the different functions. And the ones that I've seen work slowest and slowest to react are the ones that do keep those stovepipes. So that lesson has to be repeated several times. David, that's great. Before I close, are there any final thoughts that you'd want to share with the audience out there?
Len, I'm an absolute advocate for the procurement function. I still think that procurement is the third most powerful or knowledgeable part of any organization. I know you'll disagree, but for me, procurement is the future. I would encourage anyone that has any ambition within that space to get involved. There is so much power, so much knowledge, and so much interest to be had from the roles that I would encourage anyone to look at it.
Excellent, David. Thank you very much. And if you'd like to find out any more information, please visit us at cscmp.org and look out for future events, not just for the UK Roundtable, but across the worldwide Roundtable network. Thank you very much and goodbye.